Good job hiding your disdain for my title, Austronesianist. Okay, so I know I'm the last talk before lunch. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. So Andy joked about how we went from penultimate to anti-penultimate and further away from the edge. Well, I live life on the edge, so we're talking about the right edge today. Final glottal stops, H's, and zero. All right. So just a quick introduction as a background. The reconstruction of Proto Austronesian final laryngeal consonants has been a prevailing issue in the literature. Those are always very fun. There have been many different approaches taken to trying to reconstruct these segments, and there have been several different conclusions that they've come to. Most agree that there should be probably at least three categories that were distinctive, but some want more, and there's really no agreement on the phonetic values. So I'm just going to run through those really quick. So Isidore Dayan reconstructed this capital H versus glottal stop versus zero. I put star zero here. It's a little silly, but I just mean these were vowel final words. Okay, I know that zero wasn't a real phoneme. I'm just a shorthand. So bear with me, folks. Tsuchida was up in 1976. He actually split the capital H into two and had this four-way distinction. But he disagrees with Dayan on which words should have glottal stops, and actually only reconstructs this one word for to see. So a little bit iffy there on if it's really warranted. We'll come back to this one at the end. David Zorc proposed a similar system, capital H, glottal stop, and zero. His approach was based primarily on Malayo-Polynesian, so he reconstructs a lot more glottal stops, but they're based on lots of Philippine data, etc. Now, Robert Blust was very much not a fan of the final glottal stop thing. And he actually, in 2018, though, based on some new data from David Zorc and looking back on Tsuchida again, he says, okay, maybe the two H's kind of makes sense here, but he calls it H, X, and zero. And then Cigar comes in and bases his comparisons on how they correspond, that's the word, correspond to Tradai tones, and he reconstructs a four-way distinction with this additional thing. So if you haven't been paying attention to this very lively debate for the past half century, there it is. It's a bit of a mess still. So there's a couple of issues that people have raised about previous ones. So first of all, is this final glottal stop justified? Tsuchida really only puts one reconstruction that has it, right? And then Zorc glottal stop, Blust pointed out maybe something to do with final Q instead, because many of the languages you looked at, it reflects Q as a glottal stop. But then again, this X that Blust reconstructs for one of the finals has been called into question as well. Paul Lee, first, it was based primarily on the fact that Atayalik has some final X's, but Paul Lee says this X doesn't really have a historical source. And then Cigar points out that Blust's comparisons include some Atayalik unique suffixes like nuch. If you were watching Andy's talk before, you saw some words ending in this nuch suffix that is an Atayal only thing, so not historically from Proto-Austronesian. And then yesterday we had a talk that by Song yesterday that Atayalik X is probably a borrowing originally. So so the X is definitely a little bit suspicious, I think. And then the thing that we want to look at is, are the Formosan reflexes accurate for our comparisons? Because most of the discussion is based on Tsuchida's comparison. And while Tsuchida is an excellent fieldwork, I would trust him with my life when it comes to fieldwork stuff. Some of the data that he used in his comparisons were not collected by himself, and or there were languages that he wasn't focusing primarily on at the time. So I think now that it's been 50 years later, we have a lot better understanding of what Formosan sounds like. Maybe we can go back and double check to make sure it's all good. So questions for today. Obviously, how many laryngeal contrasts, including final open vowels, I'm including that there, should be reconstructed in Proto-Austronesian? And what were the phonetic values of these final laryngeal consonants, if any? So the same questions we've had for 50 years, basically. So before we go anywhere else, I want to talk about final glottals in Bunun. Bunun plays an interesting role in the story because if you look at the comparisons, and this is adapted from Tsuchida's comparisons of the Formosan reflexes, you can see that Amis, Saishiat, Pazeh, Atayal, and Seyek all sort of agree in how they split their reflexes. So they all have this H1 phoneme reflected the same way as one way, and then the H2 and the zero finals are the same for them. But Bunun has a different split. They've got the H1 and H2 agreeing, which Tsuchida says was the final H, and then the zero one is the odd one out. So Bunun is a key point in reconstructing this three-way contrast here. So it's important that we get a good picture of what Bunun is really doing. So one thing about this is Tsuchida's data, he focused on the Takituduf dialect of Bunun. He transcribes a final H for some words that contrast with glottal stop in his data. However, Paul Lee, 1988, reconstructed Proto-Bunun. I know there was some controversy the other day when the Shibata characters were cited for Proto-Bunun, but Paul Lee is the one to go here, okay? He gave a different analysis for finals. He reconstructs, he says that final glottal stop is phonemic in Bunun, while H is not. It's not there. But if you have worked on Bunun before, you can sometimes hear this sort of breathy, almost H-like sound word finally for some words, especially when they're uttered in isolation. So this is what the two are arguing about, and we're trying to determine, okay, which ones are actually phonemic. So there's quite a bit of support that the glottal stop is phonemic here, but not H. And the easiest way to demonstrate this is, I think, if you look at the allomorphy of case markers that appear in Bunun. So the nominative case marker in the Takpanuat dialect, which data is based on, generally appears as but criticizes to whatever the previous word was, and it takes the final consonant of the previous word as its onset. So like tangis plus a will become like tangisa, like that. And the same thing happens for all consonants, including glottal stop. So glottal stop behaves exactly the same way all other final consonants do in Bunun. However, there are some words where instead of this ga appears, and it's precisely on those words that sound like they might have an H at the end of them when they're in isolation. So this ga appears almost as if to compensate for a non-consonant final that's happening here. And based on this, I think we can reasonably conclude that the H is probably some sort of emphatic, this is vowel final sound, while the glottal stop is actually a true consonant phoneme, even in word final position. So we adopt the analysis given by Paul Lee that glottal stop is phonemic, H is not, in final position at least. And contrast of Bunun final glottals is thus glottal stop or nothing. And we did a quick cross-dialectal check to make sure that it wasn't, just one dialect or anything like that. The allomorphy I talked about before does occur in basically all dialects of Bunun, but we did a comparison of one central and one northern dialect to see if they agreed on which words ended in glottal stop, which words ended with nothing. And they did. The two dialects, basically, we looked at a few dozen words. They were consistent throughout. So the reconstruction of a Proto-Bunun final glottal stop, it was straightforward. And straightforward is one word. But anyway, so here is an example of some words with a glottal stop at the end. So we got words like dog, eye, breast, above, maple. So different types of words. There's no real limitations on what class of words it can be or anything. It's just throughout the vocabulary. Same thing for zero finals. Found in all sorts of words. So there's a very distinct glottal stop versus zero phonemic difference in Bunun. So the story starts to look a little bit different. The two sort of H's or X's reconstructed by Tsuchida and Blust were kind of based on tacitly, based on the fact that that Bunun has both of them as an H, but actually Bunun has these as zero in actuality, and instead has this very phonemic glottal stop here that corresponds to the zeros in their reconstruction. So we're going to take a look at the other Formosan final laryngeals, and these are, I think, a little bit more straightforward. So Amis, which is a key part of the comparison, has a phonemic final pharyngeal fricative and a phonetic glottal stop. So words that would otherwise end in a vowel have this inserted glottal stop. They also have an epiglottal stop from Proto Austronesian Q, but we're not worried about that today. So summary, basically just a two-way distinction that looks like this. Hazeh is the same, essentially, although Blust describes the H phoneme as being kind of varying between pharyngeal and a regular swallow. but essentially the same sort of contrast is found. Now, Saishiat it's a little bit hairier. We've got a phonemic glottal fricative, not pharyngeal, glottal fricative, and a phonemic glottal stop. And also, I should mention that these also can come from other phonemes in Proto Austronesian, but that's not really important to the discussion. There are some zero final words in the language, but they're limited to certain verb forms, as described by Zaytun et al., and as well as a small set of function words that tend to end with no final consonant. A survey of the Dongha dialects word list collected by Paul Lee in 1978 showed out of a total of 1,428 words, only 18 end in zero, while 105 end in H and 350 in glottal stop. And all of these 18 words are things like pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, conjunctions, etc. So it's a very limited class of words that are allowed to end in nothing. So technically, we have a phonemic H versus glottal stop distinction, but the contrastiveness of this final glottal stop is in a limited set of words there. Proto-Austronesian is basically the same story, although they have this added X involved, and the H is pharyngalized, as Andy talked about in the Tayal. But as we said, the X is historically unaccounted for if you look at if you compare Proto-Austronesian and Proto-Tayalic words. And as Song said yesterday, it was probably introduced via borrowing. And the glottal stop, according to Lee, may have been some sort of phonetic thing. And the contrast between glottal stop and zero, as far as I can see, is very limited as well. And in Lee's list of Proto-Tayalic reconstructions, it only occurs in the zero final only occurs in pronouns. So once again, a similar situation to Saishiat. We've got a pharyngeal fricative versus glottal stop and some zeros, but very limited. And when we compare words that have these finals across these languages and Bunun, we see a very clear three-way sort of distinction. We've got H's and pharyngeals here and zero for Bunun. We've got some glottal stops. Some are inserted. Some are, questionable phonemic status. And then we've got a zero in Bunun. And then everybody has glottal stops at the bottom. Okay? So three-way correspondence, I think, is very justified for this. So now we can reconstruct the PA and final laryngeals and let's try to do it again to check our work. The first one, I think, is pretty clear. We've got pharyngeal fricatives in a bunch of them. Saishiat has an H here. But I think we can probably safely conclude that this was probably originally a pharyngeal fricative in Proto Austronesian. The next one, we've got these zeros and glottal stops for Amis, Saishiat, Pazet, and Proto-Tayalic. But like I said, at least in Amis and Pazet, these definitely are not contrasted with zero. And Saishiat and Proto-Tayalic also is very limited when it contrasts with zero. Meanwhile, Bunun definitely has zero. So I think here, it seems like no one's really arguing for there to have been a phonemic anything. So I think this is where we would reconstruct zero or open final vowels when we see this sort of correspondence. And then finally, we've got, once again, these guys are not very clear in terms of what it should be, but Bunun has a very clear final glottal stop here, and I think this is where we would reconstruct a final glottal stop at the Proto-Austronesian level to explain what we see in Bunun. And also, I mean, we do see glottal stops elsewhere, although they're not quite phonemic anymore. Okay, so we've got a different reconstruction put up here. I think it's pretty reasonable based on the reflexes that we see. And but the one thing that you could maybe complain about this is like, well, if it's just Bunun, like how do we know there was really a three-way distinction or something like that? Well, Tsuchida also included some comparisons with Malayo-Polynesian, specifically Akalanon, which is a language spoken in the Philippines. And he noted that Akalanon had a very regular sound correspondence with the Formosan languages, which is rare because if you try comparing Malayo-Polynesian final laryngeals with Formosan ones, it gets very irregular and messy very fast. But the Akalanon data is quite regular, and we can see that it matches the Bunun pattern. Basically, words that we would reconstruct with a pharyngeal final and a zero final, they have ending with an H, while the words that we construct with the glottal stop final, they have a zero. So the same pattern as Bunun, slightly different reflexes of the things. Now, this is, of course, very exciting if you think, oh, maybe like Bunun and Malayo-Polynesian are closely related, but I don't think so. I think this is probably just accidental. Bunun probably just had a deletion of the final pharyngeal fricative because we see the Proto Austronesian H deleting, as far as we can tell, deletes across the board. But Aglanon has kind of a more complicated history of its finals, as far as I can see. Proto Austronesian Q becomes a glottal stop becomes 0, 0 becomes H, and merges with the pharyngeal H. So it's almost like this chain sound shift that we have going on. The only weird thing is the 0 kind of spontaneously becoming H. But I think if we consider what we see in Bunun with this sort of emphatic H sound that's added in, perhaps that becoming a phoneme in its own right is not too out of the question. There's one irregularity with the Aglanon data, and that is the word to see, kita, which is the single word that Tsuchida reconstructed with a glottal stop in his data, presumably based on this irregularity with Aglanon. Now, all this data is based on David Zorg's wordless or dictionary rather, and he usually marks words that he believes are borrowed. He does not say this one is borrowed, but I wonder, could this one also have been a borrowing, which explains the irregularity? I don't know. I'll see him next week, so I'll ask this week rather. Comparisons, like I briefly mentioned before, Blust compared these PN categories that he reconstructed with HX0 with the data from just 5 Malayo-Polynesian languages, and this resulted in 13 different sound correspondences, which, we're probably not going to reconstruct 13 varieties of H at the Proto Austronesian level, and of course Blust was not about that either. So he kind of he calls these the mystery aspirates because it's not really explainable. But Sagart in 2019 kind of argues against this. And he says, well, the irregularity seen in the Philippine data is likely due to there just being more loans between these languages than we think. Identifying loans from closely related languages, which could have had different contrasts in final laryngeals, could be difficult if based solely on correspondences of other segments, which might be reflected the same way. I see some Philippines experts nod. In fact, great. Smaller languages that were considered in Blust's work, if you consider some of the smaller languages, may also have been more likely to be influenced by larger languages, and I think and may have had more loans that would throw off the correspondences a bit. And I think it's a very fair argument that he makes there. But for now, I think it remains a challenge to find regular correspondences between Formosan languages and most Malayo-Polynesian languages. So those of you guys working on Philippine languages, if you see anything like this, any data that agrees with any of this stuff, give me a call. Day or night, because I would love to talk to you about it. I'd love to hear more about it. So I think I'm actually quite ahead of time. We will conclude here. Conclusion 1, basically we agree with the proposal that PAN had a 3-way contrast of final laryngeals and open vowels, but our correspondences are a little bit different. We reconstruct a pharyngeal H where others put like an H or capital H, and we reconstruct this glottal stop for where others put 0, and where they reconstructed the third, H or X phoneme, we would say is 0. So I think in spirit, we all do agree that there was probably some sort of an H, a glottal stop, that contrasted with 0 final words, but I think we just disagree on which words fall into which category. So there are some remaining questions, I think, that come from this observation. First of all, if Proto Austronesian had a final glottal stop, did they have a medial or initial glottal stop? Tsuchida and Dayan really only reconstruct a small handful of glottal stop words in their reconstructions, and a popular one that I've seen several people reconstruct with a glottal stop medial is the word to eat, which Bunun also has a glottal stop in there, at least in some forms. So maybe, but we're not really going to explore that any further today. And how do the new PAN finals correspond to Kradai tones? I think is an interesting question that Sagart raised. Sagart's comparison, when I looked at it from the lens of what we reconstruct, there didn't seem to be a lot of regularity there, but don't quote me on this. I'm not a Kradai expert by any means. So if you guys are any Kradai experts, if you see any comparisons there, let me know also. love to hear. Yeah, and also Sagard's comparison kind of led to an additional final fricative to kind of to make sense of the correspondences. But that was not really based on Austronesian internal evidence. That was just top-down comparisons with Kye. So is there a regularity there? We'll see. To be continued. Okay, so here are my references, and that's it. It's time for lunch.